Welcome to the series Critical Thinking Skills in Science. We're in Chapter 10, Critical Thinking, Session Number 2. Critical thinking skills and their characteristics. What are the characteristics of critical thinking skills? One is observation. Is that what's required as one of the skills is be observant, to be able to capture your what is happening around you. Number two is to do that is curiosity. You must be curious about why things happen or how things happen or why is it that way. Number three is objectivity. In other words, you're looking at objects. You're studying objects in the world around you, trying to isolate off your biases. But it's objectivity. It's introspection. Well, in other words, okay, so now you're introspecting what you're thinking and how you're thinking, and are your processes then objective? Analytical thinking, number 5. Okay, so in other words, you need to analyze, which means to look at something and take it apart and then look at the pieces and reassemble again, maybe in a different order, maybe in a different way to synthesize or make something new. So it's analytical thinking, taking things apart. It's identifying biases, which then go back up to introspection, but it's identifying the biases of the people that are presenting the information, but it's also identifying your biases in processing that same information. Determining relevance. How relevant is the information? What is it used for? Why is it practical or not? Inference. What are the conclusions? What would your conclusions be, or what they should be as drawn from the available information? Continued. What are other thinking skills characteristics? Compassion and empathy. So in other words, you're entering in dialogue. You're looking at somebody's report, somebody's evaluation, and you are looking at it with compassion and empathy and with humility. In other words, you may not be in agreement, but you don't have to enforce or put on your perspective. 11, willing to challenge. Now it's kind of like, okay, humility and compassion, but now it's shifting gears a little bit and saying, okay, willing to challenge the status quo. But this is kind of odd a little bit, because at the same time, you cannot challenge the status quo within the discipline you're looking at if you are applying the status quo. So in other words, you're supposed to follow the status quo, but at the same time, willing to challenge the status quo. Number 12, open-mindedness. In other words, again, you're coming to critical thinking generally with your biases, with your network of thinking and how to think. And so what they're saying is you must come open-mindedly and you must be open to other perspectives. Number 13, aware of common thinking errors. Okay, so you must be recognize that there are errors in thinking, and you should be open to recognizing your own thinking errors as well as the errors of those that are publishing the information. 14, creative thinking. So in other words, it's kind of like, okay, we have a problem. We're looking at this and we're critical thinking, so we need to get creative in how we solve that within the resources that we have available. The effective communicators. So in other words, we need to say what we're thinking. We need to express auditorily what our processes are. We need to express and show how we are processing the information. And we need to be active listeners. So if someone else is effectively communicating, we need to be actively listening, which means that we're not just there absorbing or watching visuals, but we are engaged and actively listening. So these are the characteristics that go along with the skills, which would take a lot of work to develop those within a student body. Critical thinking skills from a cultural perspective. Okay, the majority of those character traits that we just went over can be categorized as Western cultural tendencies, meaning that if our classroom has non-Western students, non-Western cultural tendencies students in it, they will not be in agreement with many of those characteristics that are a part of critical thinking. Not in disagreement, but their cultural upbringing would prohibit them from expressing those same ideas. And that's what came out in this teacher's magazine, Critical Thinking Skills from a Cultural Perspective. Because culture strongly influences the attitudes, values, and behaviors that students and teachers bring to the instructional process, better teacher preparation is a major factor in solving the problems of underachievement. Okay, so what are they suggesting here? That the teachers come better prepared to solve the problems of underachievement. So if we have students that are not achieving the desirable skills and not implementing them, then what are we to do? Well, it says then we are to be better prepared as a major factor in solving the problems of underachievement. So what we would call underachievement might be students that are not equipped culturally to demonstrate those thinking skill characteristics of challenging the status quo, of being independent, of developing your own thought processes, and etc., which is required for critical thinking. Many of our students would come into the classroom inhibited from learning or expressing those kind of thoughts because it is not within their cultural practice or values, or mindset. And so what this bulletin towards teachers is saying is that because culture strongly influences the attitudes, values, and behaviors that students and teachers bring to the instructional process, better teacher preparation is a major factor in solving the problems of underachievement. Okay, so what it sounds like is that then it is the teacher's responsibility to bring those underachievers up to the level necessary to practice critical thinking skills, which from my perspective then would mean, okay, then what you have to do is reculturate them into a new culture, into a different culture that does not prohibit them from expressing themselves or expressing their ideas in a way that might not have been acceptable by their previous cultural tendencies. So the question would be, and we have taught cross-culturally, what do we do? Do we teach then respecting the students' non-Western culture, or do we train them to think as Western culture requires? So that's kind of a catch. And myself working in culture anthropology, my objective in thinking is to preserve, not to impose. If I am a Western-based teacher, but I am teaching in a non-Western environment, then what is my goal? Do I protect that non-Western environment and try to present things in a way that is acceptable culturally to those students? Or do I need to re-educate those students into a Western cultural perspective so that they would be more adept at applying or implementing the type of critical thinking skills that the Western school system demands? Here on the board, I have a chart that we put together before, but it's condensed from chapter 2 on the cultural differences. And it's got the characteristics here, and then it's got the Western tendency and the non-Western tendency. And we're just going to look at them and go do a refresher going over saying, okay, this tendency that is a part of critical thinking, this is what the student must possess. Is that a Western or non-Western tendency? So we have here's the locus of authority, the first one. In the Western tendency, locus of authority is internal, self-driven. Okay, and that is a very major factor in critical thinking, because in the definitions we had, critical thinking is self-adjusting, is self-thinking, self-correcting, and so in other words, it requires a lot from the self. But yet, where is the locus of authority of our students? The locus of authority of a Western-based student is internal, and so that student is able to comply, and it has been equipped to make those internal value judgments. Whereas in the non-Western, the locus of authority is external to them. So in other words, it's other responsible. It's the authority outside of them that they give allegiance to, and so it is not within their right or authority to be self-evaluating, to be self-adjusting, to be self-criticizing, to be and so in other words, it's kind of like, okay, well, this locus of authority is an important one in critical thinking, but yet on our chart, it is a locus of authority being internal is a Western perspective, and external being a non-Western. So what do we do? Do we need to re-educate the non-Western students so that they don't feel inhibited by the external authority structure that they've been brought up under? Number two, the authority structure. How does that locus of authority affect the authority structure of the person? In other words, the structure of the person is self-independent. In other words, the Western student, the Western person, is self-centered and independent of everybody else. Or whatever authority. The authority is internal to them, and so they can act on and make decisions according to that internal locus. And so that makes them self-independent, makes them autonomous. In other words, they don't have to consult with the external authorities, whether it be a teacher or a parent or whatever is that external authority. They don't have to consult with that authority, is because it's internal to them. They are autonomous. And since they are internal and autonomous, it creates a competitive nature between students, because now each student is autonomous. They aren't striving to gain knowledge together. They're striving to compete for how that knowledge is implemented. So in other words, this creates or is based on a very specific cultural identity, cultural tendency, whereas in the non-Western, they are not autonomous or self-independent. They are other dependent. They are dependent upon their colleagues, their co-students, upon their teacher of authority, upon the parents, upon the community. So in other words, they are very driven by consensus, driven by the group. And so they're other dependent. They're dependent on every others. They are community dependent. They are not autonomous. They are very community centered, which means the focus is not on self. The focus is on inside out towards the community itself. It is cooperative. It is not competitive, it's cooperative. All for one and one for all, which is a very different feeling when you are striving to teach critical thinking, which is, again, self-centered, which is self-promoted, which is self-governed, which is self-critical. All those tendencies are for within a system of students that reflect those cultural values. And if the student comes from an upbringing or an environment that does not reflect those values, then they will not be equipped or feel comfortable in participating in what the Western world education calls critical thinking. Cognitive processing type. And this is, I believe, is important. The cognitive processing type of a Westerner culture type is auditory. And auditory processing is what the school system is built on, which is lecture mode. Lecture is listening and processing through auditory processing. When a Western student hears a lecture, they hear a voice within their head. And through that voice, they follow and they track and they process the information. Whereas in the non-Western, the processing mode is more visual. And so if they go into a lecture hall mode and to listen, then what their mode of processing is generally is not auditory, it's not listening, they don't hear a voice. They're trying to paint a picture. They're trying to put together a picture of what they're hearing. And if the words are spoken quickly, or if the words are more technical, then there could be problems in trying to process a lecture through a visual mode of processing. But so there's the conflict, or can be a conflict, of critical thinking. Critical thinking requires auditory mode processing, hearing a voice, listening to that voice, and you're hearing the information come in, and the information is being processed through auditory channels. So what then is the type of logic? Well, the type of logic produced by the two different tendencies would be, one is that the logic of auditory processing is very singular. In other words, it goes in through your ears and through the channels, and it's selective. You have to select one source to process through auditory. So it promotes a linear, systematic, or sequential, systematic, predictable type of thinking. So the thought processes that an auditory thinker develops is something that is linear, something that is sequential and systematic. And that very much defines Western thought, Western thinking. But if the student is a non-Westerner, the type of logic that is through visual is called block logic. It's a block. And it's kind of, how is that different? Well, it's not linear and it's not systematic. The logic is in a block. So in other words, you can have different ideas that are opposing or contradictory, but they're each in a different block, which then means they both can be true and contradictory, because they are not in a linear line, sequential line of thinking. So that's how a non-Western thinker can think differently and can process things differently. And just for an example, in theology, a Westerner tends to have problems with believing in a God that is loving, that really cares, that created us, and will chastise us by sending anyone to hell because of disbelief or because of actions, because of what's happened. A Westerner sequential systematic thought processing cannot compute that, whereas a non-Westerner thought is block logic, saying, yes, God is loving. But if you reject his love, then there are consequences, and there is his wrath, which can include a place of hell, of eternal suffering. Those are different blocks. And again, Scripture was produced by a non-Western cultural block. So it is block thinking that produced it. Okay, location of thought. How is that different? Well, the location of thought, again, for Westerner is internal, which means it's abstract. It's detached from the outside world, which means a Westerner has more area to roam in, let's say, because their thought is not tethered to the real world. Their thought is internal and can go hypothetically in a lot of different directions and does not need experience based to think on it. So in other words, that they are internal, abstract, which means that it's taken out of context. It doesn't need a context of this thought process. And it is reductionistic. It's reduced. The thought can be reduced to just the thought itself and reapplied to a different context. Whereas in a non-Western, the location of thought is based on external experience. It's very concrete. It is not abstract. It is very concrete. It is holistic, and it is visually based. So these are different things. So when we ask a non-Western student to critically think about a hypothetical situation internal, it's kind of like it really can't be done, because we are asking something to be done that is totally against or not within the capacity that they have been cultivated to think about, to be able to think within those parameters. Type of thought, orientation. The Westerner, their type of thought tends to be and can be very futuristic, into the future, because the thought process is not tied to a context. That you can invent a context then that would be futuristic, and that goes right along with Western thinking, because of their thought process is detached, is abstract within the mind, and that is where we can sell different products to a Western mind that we can't sell to a non-Western. And one of those biggest products is insurance. In the Western world, insurance is a big part of it. We have insurance for everything because we hypothetically think of different scenarios that could happen that we need to be prepared for. And so then we buy insurance. But in a non-Western world, insurance is not a highly sought after commodity, and not just because of the lack of funds, even though funds are usually less available, but it's a priority in that it doesn't come to mind of what about taking care of future through insurance. So the Western mind is futuristic, is hypothetical, preventative, it's analytical, it's critical, questioning, and progressive. Okay, you look at those characteristics of a Western student and you would say, yeah, I can see that. They are analytical, they are critical thinking, they are questioning, and they are progressive. Those are attitudes that a lot of times are not looked upon favorably within a non-Western context. It is not favorable for a student to question the authority of a teacher, question the authority of parents, question the authority of whatever source has been taken the authority. The students, out of respect and out of humility within their culture, do not question, do not sense that they have the right and the ability to critique, to be critical, to be analytical, to be questioning, or progressive in thought, which progressive meaning not conservative, in that many Westerners are very progressive in that they're thinking, always producing a new product for the next year in consumerism, or just changing thoughts theologically. It's progressing. They often do not hold to a conservative view of thought, that it's always thought that's developing to the next level. Whereas the non-Western type of thought orientation is, it's historical. It's very practical, problem-solving, reflective, meditative, submissive, and conservative. Very different. And so it's kind of like, okay, how do you apply critical thinking into a thought process that is conservative, that is respectful, that is historical, practical, problem-solving, reflective, meditative, submissive? How do you then... So I think that is what that teacher's bulletin was saying, is that to correct the underachievement of some students, the teacher must be prepared to meet those challenges, which I don't know if that's advocating then really a cultural shift and teaching and imposing more of a cultural tendency. Product of thought. Number 7, product of thought processes. With the Western thought, well, it's abstract ideas. It's thoughts that haven't happened yet. So it's technology that hasn't been invented yet. So it's abstract ideas. It's new technology with many original producers. And so that's what is expected, I would think, out of critical thinking, is that you have this product, we have this thought, we have this technology. Now let's critical think about analyzing it, taking it apart, reassembling it, and reapplying it to a different context, to a future context. That type of thinking would not happen in a non-Western cultural tendency. Their ideas are not abstract, not taken out of context. Their ideas are very concrete ideas from the context. The ideas are visual. The ideas are creative problem solving. And because they can see things and they can visualize, they are great reproducers, imitators of what nature produces and also of what technology from other cultures produce. And so it's kind of like, okay, so we have two different mindsets or product of thought processes here in that just because of the bias of how the thinking has been cultivated. And that's why culture it should not be a passive welt build, but it is, as the Germans developed it to be, it is aggressive. It is very active. It is protecting the cultural values and thought processes of that particular culture. Number 8, tendency of the personality. We can say that certain cultural groups have a certain personality. Kind of like, well, what are North Americans like? You know, if you're from South America or you're in a different context, North Americans have a specific character quality trait that can say, okay, well, North Americans tend to be ... Well, there's also others that say, well, South Americans tend to be ... And so it's kind of like, okay, what are those tendencies, personality traits? Well, for a North American or a Western personality trait is that they tend to be precise. They tend to be progressive. They tend to be private. They tend to be skeptical. They tend to be loud. They tend to be forceful. They tend to be not followers. They tend to kind of bull ahead or push ahead in things. And so that would be a tendency personality, which again is a part of critical thinking. Critical thinking requires precision. It requires progressive thinking. It comes from the private thought enterprises, the self within. And bottom line is, it's skeptical. It does not believe. It does not believe things that do not have adequate reason, adequate evidence, adequate. So in other words, a Western character personality trait does tend to be very skeptical, does tend to question things, does tend to be precise and progressive. Whereas the non-Westerner is not so precise and technical, which is black and white and cold, just the facts, ma'am, as Dragnet would say. But a non-Westerner tends to be very colorful and very plugged into their surrounding and very joyful, jubilant, and reflecting the life that surrounds them. They are conservative in the fact that they have probably practiced the same type of things and beliefs for generations. This is the way we've done it. This is the way we've plowed the fields. This is the way we've harvested. This is how we've planted. This is how, because they are a conservative culture. They are community. In other words, they don't do things in competition to outdo the neighbor in production or whatever, but they are community driven to bring the whole community up together. And they tend to be believing. In other words, that they are not generally equipped to think internally as their own authority. They have a tendency to believe what an external source may say. And so critical thinking then, in that vein, is to combat against believing, and believing things that aren't justified through human reason and through evidence. And so those are things that would be very questionable, saying, well, critical thinking then, to critical think, then you must question what you've believed and practiced, maybe even for centuries. So in other words, critical thinking is Western, and critical thinking and its characteristics of what are involved and needed within that realm are Western. So in other words, okay, does that mean that non-Western people do not critically think? Well, as defined by the different disciplines, that could be true, by Western disciplines and Western definitions. But as we're going to see in other chapters, we're going to look at critical thinking as espoused by non-Western cultures. So this is not to say that a non-Western culture cannot critically think, but I would say that a non-Western culture does not critically think and surrender their cultural values in a way that Western culture expects. So again, here is the summary of the same chart with the different characteristics, but giving it a Western tendency. So I think that just looking it through, you go down again, you can go down the locus of authority, the authority structure, the cognitive processing type, the type of logic involved, the location of thought, type of thought orientation, product of thought processes, and tendency of personality. You go down those characteristics and you look over at the Western side, and that is pretty much what is required to successfully critically think within a Western educational concept. Here is an article that was published, and you can tell by the names on the article, at least one of them may be a non-Western name, but this is an academic research article that was published, and the title of it is Exploring Cultural Differences in Critical Thinking. Is it about my thinking style or the language I speak? Okay, so this has been brought up because there is, there's a lot of instances of where we think students are not equipped to critically think, when in fact they may be very brought up and very respectful of their cultural tendencies that taught them how to critically think within their culture. So, critical thinking is not that easy of a concept to define, to teach, and to implement. And if we have students that are of another cultural persuasion, then what is our duty as a professor, as a teacher? Is it to equip that student to critically think in a Western context, which would mean deculturalizing them of their original culture and reculturalizing them into a Western culture? Or do we seek to maintain the integrity of their own culture and try to teach critical thinking within their context? This is session number 2, terminating. This is Critical Thinking, Chapter 10, session number 2. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. Again, those are the addresses if you'd like to communicate with us. Thanks again for accompanying me.